Hei alle sammen, og velkommen til webinaret fra Mix til Master på 10 minutter i regi av oss i Masterchannel og våre gode venner i Indigoboom. Vi har et par minutter, vi tar et par minutter og venter på at alle kommer seg inn. Jeg ser at tallet på participants her stiger. Så da venter vi et par sekunder. Mens vi venter, så kan jeg jo si at vi har en Q&A-funksjon her i Zoom, for dere som ikke er kjent med den fra før. Vi kommer til å, Kristian her kommer til å svare på spørsmål underveis i webinaret, og så kommer vi også til å ta et par spørsmål i plenum. Så vi oppmuntrer dere til å sende gjennom spørsmål. Yes. All right. Da kan vi jo sette i gang. Nå er vi 2 minutter ut i webinaret. Først og fremst, jeg heter Victoria og er CMO i Masterchannel. Det er veldig kult å se at det har vært så stor interesse for webinaret. Vi har over 100 påmeldte i dag, så det er veldig gøy. Vi skal straks kjøre en kort introduksjon av panelet vårt, Kristian og Simon her. Men først og fremst litt mer praktisk informasjon. Jeg ser at det kommer et spørsmål om webinaret blir tatt opp, og det blir det. Sånn at dere kan se det i etterkant hvis dere ønsker det. Vi kommer til å sende ut en oppsummeringsmail med litt informasjon som vi går gjennom i webinaret i morgen. Så da kommer også linken til det innspilte webinaret da. Yes, da tenker jeg at, en ting til. Vi har satt av en time for webinaret, frem til klokken 8. Om det blir en hel klokketime kommer litt an på hvor mange spørsmål vi får inn, men da har vi i hvert fall satt av den timen, så vet dere det. Da tenker jeg at vi kan kjøre en liten introduksjon, så kan vi jo kanskje starte med han som forstår norsk av de to, og det er jo deg, Kristian.
God dagen, mitt navn er Kristian. Jeg er daglig leder og medgründer av Masterchannel. Vi startet jo dette selskapet her i fjor, men jeg ble kjent med Simon i 2020, hvor vi da startet å jobbe med grunnteknologien til hva som er Masterchannel i dag. Jeg kommer til å ta imot deres spørsmål, så bare å stille i vei. Og er det veldig relevante spørsmål for alle, så kommer vi til å ta det i plenum i Q&A-sessionen mot slutten av denne sesjonen her. Yes.
Super. And the floor is yours, Simon.
Yes, thank you very much. I apologize for not speaking Norwegian yet. I haven't managed to learn the language fully yet, but I'm trying my best. But this will be in English, but maybe next year we'll have a session in Norwegian. So my name is Simon. Christian touched on our story. We met through actual music production friends. So I've worked in the engineering part of music for, it's been 8 years now. So I worked as a mastering engineer for around 6 years. I worked in audio research for 3 years, and it was only natural for me at some point to find a symbiosis between the two hobbies of mine. And this is essentially how Masterchannel came about. So I had a prototype up and running, and Christian was one of the first users. And then we found Norway to be the perfect place to start this. Long story short, handing it back over to Vic.
Thanks for that, guys. Right, can you help me change the slide, Simon?
Yes.
Perfect. Da switcher vi tilbake til norsk. Veldig kjapt inn på hva vi skal gå gjennom i dag. Vi skal touche på hva mastering er, som et hovedtema, og hvorfor det er viktig. Dere skal få litt tips og triks på hvordan dere kan forberede en mix for mastering av Simon. I tillegg skal dere få litt informasjon om Masterchannel som en tjeneste, og vi skal vise dere hvordan den faktisk fungerer. Og så skal dere få litt informasjon om samarbeidet vi har med Indigoboom. Og helt til slutten, som Kristian nevnte, så har vi en Q&A. Det kan også sies at hvis det er noen her som er komfortabel med å sende inn spørsmål på engelsk, så er dere velkommen til å gjøre det også. Yes, over to you, Simon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes. So as I said, I've worked in mastering for quite a while, and I'm not sure what the distribution here is of people who've worked with a mastering engineer before or people who haven't, and I tried to just explain it to everyone in the most concise manner. So as we do it in the school books, we start with the overall definition, which is mastering is the last creative step in the audio production process, the bridge between mixing and replication or distribution. In other terms, you have your audio production somewhere sitting on your computer, and now you want to put it out there in the world. And obviously there's a gap, and mastering is supposed to bridge that gap. And what mastering does is that it helps the producer to work on their problems they just couldn't get right in the mix, or it adds final touches that makes the record sound finished and playable on a wide variety of audio systems. So the bottom line here is you have your music that you want to sound as good as possible, and you have all these different playback systems. You know, you have your kitchen radio, you have your hi-fi system, you have your car, and in on all those systems, you want it to sound as good as possible. And that is usually what people associate with mastering. But to me personally, obviously, this is a much bigger topic than just the audio part of things. And that leads us to the why. Why would you actually consider mastering, especially nowadays where everyone has a computer and it's pretty accessible to anyone, especially now that we have tools like Masterchannel. Why is mastering important? Well, as I said, you want to make sure that your music is actually ready for the world. You know, if you are in your creative zone, you might have spent months or at least weeks on your track or your acoustic recording, whatever it is. And now it's time to actually leave that comfortable bubble of your creative space and put it out there in the world. And now it's time to think about like, okay, what will the world potentially think of this if I put it out there? And mastering is here to help. The next step is that you obviously don't want to just sound like anyone else. You want to make your music stand out. You want to be unique. If you are an artist with, you know, a mission, then you want to add something to the creative outlets out there. So you want to make sure that your music is actually heard for as unique as it is, potentially. And then the last step, and I think this is very important, especially for people who are maybe early in their music career, you want to be confident about your music, right? So you want to make sure that what you put out there is something you can actually identify with for years and not just something that you put out there and then 3 weeks later you, for the first time, get feedback from, I don't know, other producers or engineers, and suddenly you realize, oh, maybe I should have worked a little bit more on this before I actually published this. And this is where mastering comes in. So all these very abstract things is something mastering tackles. And at the end of the day, obviously, the mastering engineer usually works with you to increase your chances of success, because the more confident you are about your music, the better your music sounds, and the more it stands out from the market, the better your chances are of actually blowing up at some point. What that actually means in more technical terms, and this is probably the more common field of mastering that people usually talk about, is that you want to have the correct delivery formats. So we all know there's always new platforms popping up. Now we have TikTok. Back in the days, we had CDs. Vinyl is still a big thing these days. We have Spotify, we have Tidal, all these different platforms. And some of them have very specific requirements. And you can look them up, but you don't necessarily want to actually understand what's going on because that's a very technical process. So that's something where mastering can really help. The next step that is tightly related to this is that you want to meet technical norms. So for instance, in Spotify, they introduce some algorithms to make sure that the listening experience for listeners is very smooth. So they normalize your loudness. And so you want to make sure that what you deliver to Spotify actually works well with their algorithms, right? And if you are a full-time musician, my assumption would be you don't want to spend all day figuring out what the Spotify algorithm does. That is something that's left to the mastering engineer. They should know, okay, what are the requirements from Spotify? What are the requirements from Apple Music? What are my possibilities to make you stand out on those platforms? And then obviously you also want to meet correct sonic trends. If you listen to music from 40 years ago, you will realize that the sound landscape was vastly different from what we have today. You know, in the 80s, everything was kind of, you know, very soft on the low end and not very boomy, whereas these days you have very strong bass, very tight low end. So these things change, and that's also something that a mastering engineer is obviously aware of. And then also, you know, devices change. So 40 years ago, nobody knew what an iPod or an iPhone was. And nowadays, most of the people are actually listening on their AirPods or on the headphones. And that's also something to put into consideration, because if 90% of you people listen on headphones, you want to make sure it sounds good on headphones too. But this is not the end of the story. I think what many people miss about mastering, that is also a very musical process. So you have all these technical checkboxes that you should check if you have a good engineering process, but also musically, you want to tick certain boxes. So first of all, you want to make sure that you meet the expectations of your genre. So it's not like, obviously the delivery formats for different genres are usually the same, but the sonic habits within those genres can be vastly different. You don't want a country song to sound as harshly mastered as maybe a, I don't know, heavy metal song, right? So you want to make sure that your genre and your song go well together to a certain extent. And then in the next step, you can say, okay, but I want to do certain things differently. And this is where the I want to stand out part comes in. You want to make sure, okay, yeah, I'm aware of what the rules are. Let's break the rules. But that should be a conscious decision. You don't want to be an unconscious rule breaker, because then people might be a little bit skeptical of what you actually do. All right, let's go into some examples that illustrate this, hopefully. So I tried to pick some examples from my home country, which is Germany, and to German mastering engineers, and then a very, I think, very telling example from the States. So here we have Zoe Weiss and her song Girls Like Us, the piano version. And if you listen to the song, which was mastered by Zino Micri in Berlin, a friend of mine, you will realize that it's very, very, I would say, gently mastered, right? So it sounds very raw, very acoustic. And what Zino tried to do is really focus on the performance part of that version, right? So if you compare it to the original version, it's very punchy, it's very loud, it's a pop song. And the piano version is kind of like the opposite. He dialed down the dynamics, he made it very, very vibrant, very, it breathes a lot. And so his approach here was very different from the original. But then if we look at another piano version of a different song, which was not mastered by Zino, but this time by Ludwig, we can see that he took a completely different approach, right? It's, again, a piano version, but in this case, Ludwig decided, oh, it should actually be more similar to the original. People should still feel like it's a similar song. It's just a little bit stripped down. So in that case, Ludwig kind of went, you know, or kind of resonated more with the aspect that I mentioned of, okay, I want to actually fit more into the crowd versus standing out, whereas the previous example would have been the opposite, where you want to say like, oh yeah, we have this acoustic version that has to be completely different from everything else. And I think that's a very cool example. Also, obviously, if you listen to more technical aspects like the voice, for instance, where you can really tell, oh, it really does matter who masters my music. Even if the whole other production team are the same people, the mastering engineer can really have a drastic influence. And that's something most people are not really aware of, I would say. And that's why I picked these examples, because I think they're really revealing of this fact. And there's tons more. These are just some prominent ones. And these two are from Germany. So I thought I'd shed some light on my country. But then obviously the main mastering magic is going on in the States. And I think one example that has always mesmerized me, because I've never personally worked in rock music, is this album from Fall Out Boy, which was back in the day mastered by Pete Lumen from Infrasonic Mastering. And what you can hear here is that he definitely leaned more towards the rock side of things. So it sounds more aggressive, a little bit harsh in the high end compared to other pop songs. And then if you listen to the next album that Fall Out Boy released, which was mastered by Chris Geringer at Sterling Sound, you can suddenly hear that they took a completely different approach. Now it actually sounds more like a pop album, right? So again, same band, even the same mixing engineers, but now we have different mastering engineer. And now suddenly this whole sound or this whole perception of the band shifts towards, okay, this actually sounds more like a pop record than a rock or a punk record. So these are just some examples that I hope illustrate the importance of mastering and how important it is to pick the right engineer. And yeah, take a listen yourself maybe, and then maybe you share my discoveries or you completely disagree. That's fine. It's a subjective matter, but I think it's just important to highlight that mastering is an important process. Now, the big question is obviously, now you've learned, oh, this is very, very exciting and very important, apparently, to make my music sound competitive. Who can I actually master my music and where do I master it? 2 years ago, I would have said, yeah, come to me personally. But obviously now there are other ways out there as well. In general, if you think about where mastering is done, it's usually in high-end facilities, because since mastering is the last step of the production chain, you want to make sure that no mistakes are made at that end of the chain, right? So if you work in your bedroom studio, it doesn't really matter if your frequency response of your environment really goes down flatly to 20 hertz. But if you're a mastering engineer and you can't hear what's going on below 50 hertz, you have a big problem, because all the stuff that people master at your facility and then send out to the world might have a low-end issue. And that is, you know, yeah, that pretty much destroys your business. And so mastering is usually done in very high-end facilities. So usually the best listening environments you can find. So this picture is from Sterling Sound as well. And as I said, it's very important to pick the right engineer, because they are essentially the ones who make the changes, right? So you want to pick a mastering engineer who's dedicated to mastering. That's another important aspect. So especially these days, there's many producers who say, yeah, I can, you know, also master your track. But from my experience, at least, and obviously I'm biased because I've worked in this business myself, mastering engineers who have really focused on mastering forever, they really know the matter better than other people who just do it on the side, because it's just a different perspective on things. You know, if you're a producer or a mixer, you tend to focus on other things that are kind of hard to stay away from in mastering, whereas a mastering engineer has always learned to look at the big picture. So that's why my advice would be to always go to a dedicated mastering engineer. You also want to pick someone, if you pick a mastering engineer and you can afford it, with specific genre expertise. So it should be someone who has worked in your genre, who maybe has some cool credits. So my suggestion would be, if you save all your diamonds, to go to a top mastering facility, look at their credits and see, like, okay, which engineer actually has worked on stuff that's the most similar to what I'm producing. And then there's a high chance that they might be able to make your stuff sound great as well. And then, as I said previously, you obviously and most definitely want to make sure they work in stellar listening environments. If you see a mastering studio online and they don't show pictures of their studio, that might not have to say something, but it can also mean that their environment might not be ready to be showcased, and that can be a bottleneck, because you at home probably don't have the perfect listening environment, and you rely on them to have the perfect listening environment. And if they're not transparent about the environment they're working in, they can theoretically sell you anything, and you're not really able to judge because you don't have the same listening environment. And then the next question is where, if you feel like, okay, I have an idea of what matters in mastering, then as I said, you have facilities like Sterling Sound, Metropolis Mastering, Infrasonic Mastering, the list goes on and on and on and on. You can also pick solo engineers, of course, there's tons of them. And as I said, there's also a growing fraction in the market of people who do all sorts of engineering things, where if you really want a perfect master, I would be at least careful who to pick. But then also, and this is obviously the case for Masterchannel, a lot of the stuff that's happening in mastering is not rocket science. And we've all seen what artificial intelligence can do in the computer vision space. If you think of, fake humans being generated by AI, why would not the mastering process be something that can be tackled by AI? And I'm not giving away secrets when I tell you that all the top tier mastering facilities also have their own systems to streamline the process. So even Sterling Sound, they don't work the same way they've worked 40 years ago. They also have their streamlined processes to make it faster, because if you work on 40 songs per day, you don't start from scratch with every song. And Masterchannel kind of takes that idea further. We've talked to a lot of engineers. Obviously, my own mastering engineer experience comes into this. And there's a lot of stuff you can, with a little bit of brain power, actually automate these days. So that's also a very valid solution for people, who just want to discover what mastering is, who might not have the diamonds, as I said, to go to the best mastering engineer, or who just want to test themselves and see like, okay, where does my mix actually, where does it stand in terms of quality? Is it really ready to be mastered? Because chances are, if Masterchannel says, oh yeah, this is the best we can do and it doesn't really sound good, then I wouldn't expect a mastering engineer 10 times the price to really do that much better, right? So yeah, that's pretty much mastering who and where. And then the next question, once you've picked a service or once you've picked an engineer, is obviously, how do you actually prepare your mix? And that's another important step, because I've experienced it a zillion times, and we also see it at Masterchannel. Obviously, this is a step that many people just don't get right because no one ever told them how to do it. And the advice I've always given out in the past, and I've given this advice to, you know, major label artists and bedroom producers. This is not an amateur advice. This really applies to everyone across the industry. I usually tell people to think of it as a dentist appointment. If you go to your dentist, because that's what many people do, right? So they try to pre-master their song and then they send a master to a mastering engineer and kind of just want a stamp of approval and them saying, yeah, you did a great job. But that's not how you would go to a dentist, right? If you go to a dentist, you brush your teeth and you wouldn't want to touch anything in your mouth that they have the tools for. So that's really my main advice. Focus on what you can do with your mix, make it as error-free as possible, and make sure that you actually did your best. And then don't do what the dentist, or in this case, the mastering engineer would do, and leave all the, you know, if it's loudness stuff or dynamic stuff that you can't really figure out or you don't have the environment for, leave that up to them. And many people are afraid of giving away control, but at the end of the day, that is really what mastering is all about. You know, giving away the responsibility to someone else and trusting them that they have the knowledge, or in the Masterchannel case, that the algorithm has the accumulated knowledge to make the best decisions for you. Because that's what we want. We want an objective opinion on your mix. And as I said, in the best possible case, you have a very good mix, you get a clean polish, and you're good to go, right? That's the best dentist experience you can have. Just go in, clean polish, and you're good to go. And that's what ideally a mastering process is all about. Your mix was great, master is even better, sounds cool, you're good to go, the world is ready to hear your music. What that means in audio terms is that you want to deliver obviously in a lossless format. You don't want to compress your music. So many people say, yeah, but MP3 320 kilobits is indistinguishable for me for from WAV files. And that is very true when you play back the unaltered file. But once you start making adjustments, the algorithmic magic that MP3 does to reduce the footprint actually becomes very obvious, right? So at some point, the mastering engineer will have to make your song sound brittle and broken. So always use lossless formats. And that's also the only format Masterchannel accepts for that reason. And then you want a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz at least. If you work in a different sample rate in your project, for instance, if you classical producers, they often go way higher, up to 96 kilohertz, then you want to export in that sample rate as well and upload the same sample rate. You don't want to do sample rate conversion before sending it to a mastering engineer. That's something the engineer on Masterchannel will take care of for you. If you do it, there is a chance you break something. And then bit rates or bit depth is also important. These days in digital audio, we don't really have issues of noise floors, but 24-bit is the minimum I recommend. Most DAWs usually do 32 bits these days or even higher. We accept all of them in Masterchannel. And then kind of what I already said, right? Like let the dentist do their job. Don't do any loudness maximization and don't do any psychoacoustic effects that sound good on your system or in your headphones. If you're in doubt, rather leave it away and trust the engineer or Masterchannel to take care of it for you. We have a lot of stuff coming in and we have a very broad vision or bird's eye view on what's out there. So we can make decisions for you when it comes to loudness, dynamics, and psychoacoustics. Chances are, if you feel like, oh, this plugin, this crazy stuff that nobody else has done before, then there might be a reason nobody else has done it before you. And if this was all too fast for you and still sounds like rocket science, we actually prepared a guide for you together with our co-founder Matoma that you can find on our blog. And he also shot a little video for us where he goes through all the steps necessary to make sure your mix is best prepared for Masterchannel. Yes, that was it from my end. I hope that shed a little bit of light on the whole process, and then I'm handing it back to Victoria.
Yes, thank you, Simon. Do you want to go out of the presentation?
There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let me just check that I have the right here. There we go.
And sorry to jump in, but I'm already seeing that we're getting questions, and those are very interesting questions. I'm very happy to answer. But
go for it.
We'll let you finish, and then when the Q&A session comes, we can answer them.
Okay. All right. Let me share my screen here. There we go. All right, can you all see my screen? Great stuff. Da skifter jeg over til norsk. Dette bare fortsette på engelsk. Yes, super introduksjon til mastering som et tema av Simon der. Og det er jo her da Masterchannel kommer for å løse problemstillingen. Masterchannel er rett og slett et verktøy for artister og produsenter og labels og alle som gir ut musikk egentlig. En nettbasert masteringstjeneste som gjør automatisk mastering. Der trenger man ingen teknisk ekspertise whatsoever. Løsningen gjør all jobben for deg. Du får et ferdig masteringsresultat på under 10 minutter, og du får da en ferdig master i studiokvalitet. Kort og godt. Skal vi se. I forhold til bruksområder så er det jo sånn at Masterchannel kan brukes til egentlig hele kjeden. Alt fra session bounces til demoer og frem til ferdig master før slipp. Og mastere gjennom Masterchannel som det endelige produktet før slipp er jo perfekt for artister som do it yourself og i tillegg til labels da. Masterchannel kan også brukes som prototype verktøy før man går til en masteringingeniør, som kanskje er mer aktuelt for etablerte artister, som på en måte ønsker litt mer input før de går videre til en masteringingeniør som neste steg da. Og så kan det også brukes som til live for eksempel du skal mastere låtene dine før konserter. Perfekt for DJ-er, live acts, som rett og slett ønsker å teste ut musikken sin live før slipp, for eksempel. Når det kommer til formater, som Simon jo har snakket litt om allerede, det tekniske, så tilbyr vi 3 forskjellige formater. Det første er Lossless på 48 Hz og 24 bit. Dette er da standardformatet for distribusjon til streamingtjenestene. I det formatet så er det en revisjon inkludert. Det vil si at hvis du ønsker å gjøre noen endringer til mixen din etter at du har kjørt gjennom en master i Masterchannel, så kan du gå og laste opp, gjøre endringene i mixen din, laste den opp på nytt, og da har du en master i tillegg da. Og det formatet koster $20.95. Neste format er Hi-Res Lossless, som er på 96 Hz og også 24 bit. Det er høyere kvalitet optimalisert for hi-fi-avspilling. I det formatet så har vi 2 revisjoner inkludert, og det ligger på $25.95. Og det siste formatet er Ultimate, ligger på 192 Hz og 64 bit, som rett og slett er rå audio for da fremtidig remastering eller arkivering. Og i det formatet så er det 3 revisjoner inkludert, og det ligger på $95. Yes, skal vi se. Da skal vi rett og slett kjøre en demo. Skal vi se. Da gjør vi sånn, og så går vi inn på Channel A, skal vi se. Sånn, slik ser da nettsiden vår ut. Som dere kan se oppe til høyre hjørne her, så det to knapper. Den ene upload, og den andre account. Og nå det jo sånn at vi har et opplegg gående hvor hvis man signer opp til en brukerkonto, så får man en gratis master. Så da skal jeg for enkelhetens skyld vise dere hvordan hele kjeden her fungerer for å lage seg en konto. Så du registrerer deg med en mailadresse, fornavn, etternavn og lager deg et passord før du trykker sign up. Jeg har jo juksa litt, så jeg har laget meg en konto i forveien. Da logger vi inn her. Og da kommer man inn på brukerprofilen sin. Som dere ser her, som jeg nevnte, så får dere da en gratis mastering session. Her velkomstkoden. Så hvis man da trykker på Master Now, så kommer man inn på selve tjenesten, selve engine. Og da det egentlig bare så lett som å droppe den ferdige mixen din. Onto here. Og så laster den opp. Verifier. Så da skal det også sies at her kan du laste opp 5 låter samtidig. Og hvis du da scroller nedover her, så kan du velge et av de 3 formatene som jeg nevnte i stad. Hvis jeg da velger Lossless her, for eksempel. Og scroller ned. Da ser man at velkomstkoden inne. Trykker på continue. Og da mastering sessionen i gang. Her står det estimert tid 5 minutter, men det kan da også ta opp til 10 minutter. Og det egentlig så enkelt som det. Så mens vi venter på at den skal bli ferdig, så kan vi jo gå tilbake til presentasjonen. Skal vi se. Sånn, litt om brukerne våre. Vi har jo brukere i ganske spredt over ganske land, i over 20 land. Vi brukes av hele spekteret fra nybegynnere til grønnominerte produsenter, og brukes også av artister og produsenter på tvers av sjangere. Vi har hatt over 10 millioner streams på låter som har blitt masteret gjennom oss så langt, og 0 klager på lydkvalitet per nå. I tillegg så, hvis vi skal highlighte et par av brukerne våre, så har vi for eksempel Rain, som har en låt som heter High, som streamer over 1 million i løpet av de første 4 månedene. Vi har også Ryan fra Østerrike, som gikk både inn på viral 50-lista på Spotify, og også nummer 1 i iTunes i Østerrike faktisk, med låter som han hadde masteret gjennom oss. Så har vi også Nathan Trent, som ble nominert til en Amadeus Award, som da vel hvis jeg har forstått det riktig, tilsvarende spellemann her i Norge. Og så det jo sånn at vi også gjerne fronter artister som har masteret gjennom oss, via for eksempel både sosiale medier og en spilleliste vi har på både Spotify og YouTube. Her ser dere et bilde av hvordan det formatet ser ut. Det da social media spotlighten vår, som vi poster på alle våre socials. Så det vi kommer til å gjøre i morgen, som jeg nevnte i starten, at vi sender ut en oppsummering med litt av den informasjonen som vi har snakket om i dag. Og da kommer det også til å være en link til det Music Submission-skjemaet, hvor dere kan da gå inn og sende inn en låt til oss når dere har master gjennom Masterchannel, for å få en sjanse til å bli featuret i våre kanaler. En annen ting som kanskje kan være aktuelt for flere av de som ser og hører på, jo en aktivitet som vi har gående akkurat nå, som en remix-konkurranse med vår co-founder Matoma og Arizona for deres siste låt, Hearts So Big. Der vi rett og slett en partner, og hovedpremien ganske fet. Man kan vinne en offisiell remix-release for låta. I tillegg så også en del av premien en digital feedback session med Matoma. Og så det også et Power User medlemskap i Masterchannel, som vil si at du får gratis mastering for et år, samtidig som du også får synlighet i våre kanaler. Og det var første premien. Andreplassen får også en feedback session med Matoma, og et Power User medlemskap hos oss i Masterchannel. Så når du da har laget en brukerkonto, så kan du trykke participate på remix-konkurransen. Så hvis du har drømt om å remixe en Matoma-låt, eller har en liten remixer i magen, så det her sjansen din. Helt til slutt, litt om partnerskapet vårt med Indigoboom. Der, som vi snakket litt om i forhold til de 3 formatene våre, så det sånn at alle Indigoboomere får de 3 formatene til $11. Det får dere via å applye den koden som står der, IB-VIP, og den koden gyldig fram til 15. mai. Og så det jo sånn at, som jeg nevnte, så har tilbyr vi en gratis master til alle som lager en brukerkonto, så da jo de $11 for et format en ganske fin add-on til det. Yes, da det vel bare Q&A-en som gjenstår. Det jeg kan si innledningsvis helt til slutt, jo at vi da sender ut en oppsummeringsmail i morgen, hvor dere bare, så dere ikke finner ting på nettet etter webinaret, så kommer vi til å sende ut info. Både om remix-konkurransen, om produksjonstipsene som Simon snakket om, og Indigoboom-samarbeidet vårt selvfølgelig. Så da kommer den inn i mailboksen deres i morgen. Yes, har vi fått noen bra spørsmål, eller Kristian?
Det har vi. Det 4 spørsmål som jeg tror Simon burde svare på. So the floor is yours, Simon.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have some quite interesting questions. First one is from Oscar. He asks, what is actually the audible difference between 44.1 kilohertz and 48 kilohertz or even 96 kilohertz? Is the difference big enough to make an audible difference for the average listener? So I'm not going to open the box of the Pandora here, because this can be a very passionate topic for many people. The bottom line, I think, or the perspective we have to take on here is, what devices do most people listen on? And that is usually these days, consumer headphones, we could call them, or even worse, the ones I'm wearing right now, more like headsets. And if someone can really hear the difference between those sample rates on these type of devices, I want to take the drugs they're taking. That is purely esoteric, in my opinion. There is an audible difference under some circumstances, and that difference usually becomes audible if you convert between sample rates, because you will have a phenomenon which is called aliasing, which essentially means that the higher frequencies fold back into your mix, so to speak. And even then, it's questionable whether that's actually audible, but you can definitely see it. If you look at the spectrogram, for instance, you can kind of easily tell if someone converted sample rates. That's also why my advice is stay away from sample rate conversion, just stay in the sample rate you're working in. And also, bottom line here is 44.1 kilohertz is more than enough. There is something in physics called the Nyquist theorem, which states that the sample rate should be at least twice the maximum frequency you want to replicate on a medium. And the human ear is capable of listening to frequencies from roughly 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So our smallest frequency we want to replicate, or the highest frequency, but like the shortest wavelength, is 20,000 hertz. So if we multiply that by 2, we would have, and 44.1 kilohertz thus leaves enough room for 20 kilohertz to be accurately replicated. We have some media, like DVD, for instance, which were standardized to 48 kilohertz. And then, as I said, we have some people working in 96 kilohertz. My bottom line advice usually is for everyone, just save storage space, save computing power, go with 44.1. That's more than good enough. I think if somebody criticizes your music for not being in the right sample rate, you will have, I think you want, before somebody criticizes your music for being in the wrong sample rate, you will have many other obstacles to tackle, right? So that's actually quite a compliment if somebody has nothing else to worry about. The next question is from Christopher. He asks, is it something specific I should do when converting to higher sample rates for mastering? I'm not sure if you refer to yourself mastering and then upsampling, or if you want to upsample before sending it off for mastering. I'll answer both cases. So as a mastering engineer, you usually use special software to deal with this, that, as I said, removes these artifacts or make sure that they don't even occur, so that the upsampled audio sounds as similar to your original sampled audio as possible. If you try to do it yourself before sending it off, then just don't do it. As I said, stay within the same sample rate. If you work at 44.1, you can still get a world-class master at 44.1. There is no objective reason why a 96 kilohertz master would be better than a 44.1 kilohertz master if you worked in 44.1 kilohertz. The next question is from Torja. I hope I pronounced this correctly. I'm very sorry. Why do you offer 64-bit? The dynamic range that can be represented by a 32-bit 40-point file is 1,528 decibels. Excellent technical question. I love these. And it's a valid question. The very primitive answer to this is that our audio engine, or all the algorithms that work behind the scenes, they work in 64 bits, which is quite a novel approach. All the common DAWs, some even struggle with 32-bit, so we are way ahead in that regard. Sometimes we even work in 128 bits. And so we just wanted to offer our customers a clean pipeline, right? So if they think, oh, I want to go all in, I have all the computing resources in the world, then, and I can export 64-bit, why would we not give them, offer them open gates to our system? That's why we offer 64-bit. That's what's called the ultimate tier, because we're really maxing out our capacity on that end. And then Oscar has another question. Is it necessary to convert and dither 24-bit mixes to 16-bit masters for digital streaming, or is the converting only important or necessary for vinyl and CD? And what is pros and cons with 24-bit masters for digital streaming services nowadays? So, I mean, maybe the basic question I should answer here is, what does bit depth actually mean? And bit depth essentially means, if you think of audio as moving air particles, right, then everything that is stored in an audio file kind of represents how much those air molecules actually move. And the more bits you have, the more precisely you can replicate the amplitude at a specific sample, right? So if you have a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, you have 44,100 numbers that represent the varying air pressure, so to speak, over time. And if you have a higher bit rate, those numbers can be, like, the range of numbers is larger. And that's why 24 bits is recommended, because it gives you more freedom, especially if your audio is quieter. You have a lower noise floor, right? Because if you have only a small range of numbers, if you drop below that range, your audio is not audible anymore. So to answer your question, it is not necessary if your music is loud enough, which in 99.999% of the cases is the case. It can only become an issue if you have long reverb tails, for instance, right? If something fades out at the end of your song, there is a chance that your reverb tail drops below a certain level, and suddenly the audio completely cuts off. And in that case, you do dithering, because dithering creates an artificial noise floor that raises the volume level above 16-bit volume threshold, so that everything is actually playback, right? So if you have very, we're talking minus 100 something dBs parts in the music, you should go with 24 bits. And CD only supports 16-bit, by the way. So if you go with CD, you have to go down to 16-bit. Sorry, I have to drink a sip. All right, then we have another question from Anders. Is there any reason for choosing 48 kilohertz instead of 44.1 kilohertz? If you've, yeah, same answer. If you've recorded in 48 kilohertz, stay in 48 kilohertz. Otherwise, 44.1 is more than good enough. And another question from him. So you send in 44.1 kilohertz and then you get 48 kilohertz master. No. Oh, thank you for that question. Very good question. And it's good that we clarify this. We don't upsample your master for you. So if you worked in 44.1 kilohertz, the best master you will get back also only is 44.1 kilohertz, because there's no reason to upsample, right? What we do, however, is if you send in a 48 kilohertz master, we also give you a downsampled 44.1 kilohertz version. But we never upsample, because if there's only so much information we have, so upsampling would just be a waste of storage space. There's not more information we can create from limited information, so to speak. So that's a very good question, right? So the different tiers that Victoria described, they all, the resolutions are the limits. So for the highest resolution you get for the respective tier, that's a limit. If you send in something lower, you will get lower resolution. All right, then let me just check. We have two more technical questions. One from Marius. He asks, what makes your AI mastering better than other platforms? That's a very good question. The short answer is we have worked with the brain of mastering engineers instead of just sampling huge data sets of music, right? So a common approach for machine learning is, yeah, just look at some data and do something. What we really did is we are building a machine that is fed with knowledge from actual mastering engineers. So what we like to say is that we come from the industry for the industry. So we're not disrupting anything here. We are actually working with the industry, because even the big mastering houses, they realize, oh, there's so much new music coming out, we can't handle all this. We need some tools to actually, you know, still give us a life beside work. And that's what Masterchannel does. And so all that brain power goes into our machine. We replicate the thought process of mastering, so to speak. We don't just look at other music and try to copy settings, if that answers your question. Doesn't mean you can't be lucky with other platforms. Whatever works, you should always choose what works best for you, obviously, as I said. If you have the diamonds, please go to a mastering engineer. And then another, I think the last technical question from Oscar. How important is mastering levels higher than -14 LUFS for digital streaming services like Spotify? Is it any point of having the level of, for example, -11 LUFS, or will it just be turned down on the different platforms? Very good question. Something every mastering engineer should be aware of. So truth be told, this changes all the time, right? So now there's actually a standard coming out from the broadcast unions, for I think it's an association of all the major platforms, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And they agreed on the loudness standard, finally. Until then, it has always been more or less gambling, because Spotify could change their normalization algorithm every other week. So in the past, I had very good weeks where, you know, a client wanted a very loud master, and that master was played back enormously loud and everyone was happy. And then I had other weeks where I tried the same thing, and then suddenly everyone was disappointed because it was played back so quietly. So to answer your question, how important it is to master levels higher than -14, I'm sure I understand your question correctly, but the bottom line here is what most engineers do these days is stay between -9 and -11 LUFS, because that's a good middle ground for all platforms. And then obviously once these new standards come out and platforms actually start implementing them, we will have to reevaluate and see, okay, Do we actually have to adjust something here? Do we even have to maybe produce platform-specific masters for different platforms? Yes, and I think that is it. Or, we have one more question from Anders, and he asks, how does your AI take musicality into account? And there I can just refer to what I already said. It could be another webinar for 2 hours to describe this, but essentially this is the core of, I think, what we really strive for at Masterchannel. We want to give artists possibilities and not let them be controlled by gatekeepers. And pricing obviously is a gate many people have to pass through. So we work with engineers to make sure that the masters we offer are as musical as possible. And that obviously, it's not a harsh line between technical decisions and musical decisions, but all the technical decisions our system makes obviously have a musical influence, right? If you have very snappy dynamics, then obviously that changes the whole musical perception of the song. Whereas if you have very slow dynamics, that also completely change the dynamics of the song. So what we do is we make sure that all the technical decisions we make take into consideration the musical content of what your music sounds like. Yes. All right, then I would say we are done with technical questions, unless I've missed a question. But thank you very much for your questions. And my voice is fading, I think. So this might be a good time to call it a day. And I'm handing it back over to you, Vic.
Yes, are we through with all questions, Christian? Are we good to go?
I think there's one more question for Simon.
Oh yeah, hold up. Oh yeah, from Ingrid. Can you say something about how your algorithms work? Like which parameters are adjusted to make a good master? Is it mainly standard parameters like LUFS and correct formats? I'm just trying to phrase a concise answer here. And so to answer your first question, which parameters, I tried to answer how our algorithms work. I already said that, we don't just look at data that's out there. We work with engineers to make good decisions. So we kind of create an artificial mastering engineer. That's what you could imagine. I don't know if that helps. And then which parameters are adjusted to make a good master? And that's then a result of what I just said. Any parameters a mastering engineer could tweak is something we can tweak, right? So if your favorite mastering engineer in the world does something very specifically, we can also mathematically replicate this. So technologically, there's no limits to what we can do. We can actually, you could argue we can do more, right? Because mastering engineers, they usually just tweak knobs. And we actually look into the mathematical representation of music, which is infinite, so to speak, because we just look at raw numbers and we don't have knobs in the way and we don't have speakers in the way. But we can tweak anything, right? And the more people that use the system, the more feedback that we get, the better the system becomes and the more different ways we see how we can tweak the audio. But I can't tell you which 5 buttons there are that we tweak because there are no 5 buttons. I hope that makes sense. Is it mainly standard parameters like LUFS and correct formats? Yeah, the formats you get are definitely standard formats. So they meet what I said, all the delivery requirements, but that's obviously not as tightly linked to the other parameters that you adjust. First of all, you want to make sure stuff sounds great and makes sense musically, and then you can talk about, okay, and now we actually have to convert this into a format that Spotify accepts, for instance. I hope that answers your question, but very good questions. Love these questions. Great audience. Cool, but now I think, oh, there's one more question from Marius. Is the final master in MP3 in WAV? Obviously, I want to say it is in WAV because why only get half a taste of the music if you can get it in raw quality? So it's all raw audio, no compromises. All right, Then I think I'm handing it back to you, Vic.
Yes, and we have 5 minutes left, so that was quite good. Awesome. Da tenker jeg at jeg skifter over til norsk igjen. Mens vi har kjørt gjennom spørsmålene her, og litt over det, så har vi jo da fått inn en ferdig master fra den demoen som jeg viste dere i stad. Bare for å nevne det, så kommer den også på mail når den ferdig masteret, så dere får den rett inn i innboksen. Så vil vi gjerne takke for veldig gode spørsmål, og igjen interesse for webinaret. Og så vil vi gjerne takke Indigoboom, som har hjulpet oss å arrangere det webinaret her. Og da kan vi vel egentlig takke alt for oss. Ha en fin kveld.